Hello, and welcome to CCT-250, Network Vulnerabilities 1. My name is John Armke, and I will be your instructor this semester. As you can see, we're going to be starting with our first chapter, Hacking the Next Generation, in third edition of Hacker Techniques, Tools, and Incident Handling. So we've got our learning objectives and key concepts here. Primary objective is to explore the history and current state of hacking and penetration testing, including ethical and legal effects. Our key concepts are to look at some classes and motives of hackers, as well as the history of hacking, current state of the present involvement in cybersecurity. Ethical hacking, as it is distinctly different from run-of-the-mill hacking, what we consider to be black hat or even gray hat. And then penetration testing, commonly abbreviated as pen testing. We're also going to look at some legal implications, so laws and ethical standards for pen testers and ethical hackers, which are often one and the same. You'll hear the terms red teamers, blue teamers, as well as purple teamers on occasion, and that will reflect the stance of the technician in question. So it's important to understand before we begin common vocabulary. I tell students this all the time, is that if we don't know what we're saying, then we don't know what we're actually communicating to other individuals. This is why I tell my IT students, be very careful about jargon, because you don't want it to be that you're using terms that other people don't necessarily understand. So when we talk about hacking, we're discussing exploitation of vulnerabilities and compromising of controls in order to gain access that is considered unauthorized or inappropriate to a particular system. So if you log into your own home computer, that's not hacking. But if somebody breaks into your home computer from a remote source, or somebody tries to do password guessing at your desk, that's considered unauthorized or inappropriate access. As kind of a middle ground to that, if you give somebody your password or if you give somebody access, that is not hacking either. So I'm sure that you guys already know this, but we want to be aware of, like when somebody leaves their Facebook open or other form of social media and somebody comes in and types in just a random status to be funny, that isn't hacking. I know that that's often said tongue-in-cheek, but we always want to be sure that we're aware of. When we're talking about hacking, we're talking about legitimately exploiting some kind of hole in the security fence that is around a particular application or resource. We may also be modifying system or application features to exceed the intent of the creator. So a particular individual may create a program with a given feature for purpose A. If we can circumvent or pervert that function to purpose B, C, D, all the way down the line, then that, in a way, is hacking. And that's more so like when we get into the term like life hack or things like that. That's what they're really talking about, is to exploit it in ways of which it was not originally intended. Now, while hacking can be used ethically, it can lead to loss for individuals and organizations, and we'll get into the differentiation between the two later on. But the general thing that I want you to grasp right now is hacking ethically traditionally means that we have the involvement of the target. It is people checking their own defenses. It's making sure that the seat belts work, everything tensions correctly, making sure that you get a brake check, having your inspection done every year for your car. That could be something that would be analogous, though not exactly so, to ethical hacking. Hackers traditionally possess one or more of the following attributes, and I put them into these categories. Prodigy. This is an individual with excellent computer skills who can create and explore hardware and software. They may have a form of savantism. They may just have a large amount of experience. They may have a large background in mathematics. In any event, they understand the underpinnings of how the computer works very strongly and are able to use that knowledge in order to manipulate the functionality of that device. The hobbyist is someone who views hacking as a challenge. This can be somebody who learned about hacking through any type of popular media, like movies like Hackers or Swordfish or things of that nature, TV shows like Mr. Robot. There's a number of pieces of media that talk about hacking. And as such, there's some curiosity that arises from that. I know for me, It was Ariana Richards' character of Lex in Jurassic Park, talking about this is a Unix system. I know this. And I, at that point, was only familiar with DOS and very early versions of Windows. So that to me was just kind of a, ooh, what's she talking about? So I kind of got into it at that point. So that is a common jumping on point. But you can eventually progress away from being a hobbyist as you undertake more and more study and practice. A maverick is someone who seeks knowledge and exploration legally or otherwise. They can be either of these two prior categories, or they may be of a completely different level of experience. It's something that they're just trying to push boundaries with. So these are more of the hacktivist style iconoclasts that you will experience, who tend to have very strong beliefs about the senses of ownership and property and freedom of knowledge and personal liberties and things like that. So again, these are just very broad categories. Not everybody's going to fit squarely into each of these, nor should they. But it's important to kind of start building the schema that will allow us to understand how we look at the landscape of hacking in the modern era. Any of these individuals can hack with malicious intent and potentially compromise highly sensitive data. So we must always be aware that anyone can hack with malicious intent. That is a really critical piece of information that we want to kind of wedge deeply into our minds here. Hacking can be done benignly, but it has the possibility to lead to loss. So let's look at some different profiles, motives, some different classes of hackers. Traditionally, we look at, good guys and bad guys. That's largely where we like to fall into play. You talk about, kids playing, cowboys when they're a kid, and they're trying to catch the guy who stole the bank deposit off the train, and they're going to round up a posse and all that sort of thing. So if we live in that kind of black and white universe, we start losing some of the gradation that allows us to see where people actually fall. So as children, we play in childish ways, and as we grow older, we learn more nuance. So in this case, the good guys, you can hear the inverted commas, information security professionals who use their hacking skills to expose vulnerabilities and make the systems of their own organization, as well as other organizations to which they may be contracted, more secure. Criminals are hackers who conduct illegal activities for financial gain, and that can take a number of categories there. Amateurs, professionals, we can have different levels of experience within those categories. One that I do want to point out is, we'll talk about these individual categories a little bit further as I go down the list, but the ideologue, somebody who conducts hacking activities for ideological goals, political goals, religious goals, things like that. So let's look at these categories here. Black hat is a term that you'll hear quite often, also known as crackers. These are very skilled individuals, and they can be malicious or destructive in several ways. White hats tend to be, quote unquote, the good guys. They use their skills solely for defensive purposes with system owner permission. These are security analysts, penetration testers, ethical hackers. Now, ethical hackers can stretch into gray hat territory. This is where you can work both offensively and defensively, a little bit of purple teaming, to where you will use black hat techniques in order to carry out white hat goals. So of course, when you mix black and white on a color palette, you tend to get shades of gray, right? Suicide hackers, these are individuals who aim to bring down critical infrastructure for some cause. Because of their devotion to that cause, they are traditionally not bothered by jail or any other kind of recrimination or punishment. So these are very, very dangerous people because there's no sense of consequence that's really holding them back. Script kiddies, which is a term that it makes my skin crawl. I don't particularly care for it. But they are very dangerous because they are unskilled, and they just kind of, they imagine handing a small child, a fire hose and just letting them pull the handle. And if you've ever, if you've known anybody who works in firefighting or any kind of first response where they have to handle a water hose for any reason, that's not like a green flexi sprayer hose, but like the big canvas one that has the lever action on the front. Those take a lot of finesse and strength to be able to use effectively. So imagine handing that to somebody who is probably going to get whipped around the end of it like a lawn boy. So this is where we're giving tools that individuals do not understand or do not have any underpinnings of how they really work. So tools, scripts, apps that are developed by real hackers. So they buy these kits and they run them, and they can derive significant benefit from that, but they are dangerous in the way that they don't really know the depth to which that particular tool can wreak havoc, even on their own turf. A number of hackers probably sell kits with backdoors in them so that they can kind of peek in on what's being done with their equipment. These are sometimes called posers. We like the French spelling on that one. Cyber terrorists. So, terrorists, of course, we know the definition there. In the cyber arena, they are widely skilled individuals, and they are motivated by religion, politics, very much, that whole ideologue thing that we brought up just a little bit ago, to create fear and disruption. Related to this is the hacktivist. This is traditionally not trying to create fear so much as disruption. Cyber terrorists and hacktivists tend to be two sides of the same coin. Hacktivist tends to have a slightly more positive connotation. The second we involve terror in the terminology, then obviously we're trying to impose a negative connotation. So cyber terrorists tend to be a very prime example of that victors write history. The people who survived, the people who won, get to write the account of what happened. So you have, liberators and freedom fighters versus an oppressive regime, or you have a ragtag rebel band. So everybody likes to root for an underdog, but it is difficult to talk about this without making sure that we understand that the same general tactics are being employed by both of these groups. It's just to which connotation do we assign them. Okay? That said, cyber terrorists do tend to be a lot more blunt, a lot more violent, more often than not. Hacktivists tend to be slightly more passive in terms of potential damage that they're dealing with. It's more so disruption. Last category here in the top right is the state hacker, state agent, state actors. You'll sometimes hear them referred to. These are government-employed individuals, usually well-trained and definitely well-funded. If you think about the funding of, the U.S. military, for instance, the amount of defense spending we commit, that is an inordinate amount of money to carry out whatever operations we really feel were necessary. And of course, we'll eventually talk about things like Stuxnet and Flame, and cyber ops that have been largely purported to involve the U.S. government and Israel and things like that. Those kinds of technicians who are carrying out actions in this way are state hackers. They penetrate and damage the systems of foreign embassies or foreign governments or agencies to gain top secret intelligence, sometimes referred to as part of the competitive intelligence definition. So one of the things that we want to talk about when we're looking at hacking is prevention and control of illicit or inappropriate access. One of the common ways we do that is we talk about TAP. So the TAP principle of controls stands for technical, administrative, and physical. Technical controls are things like software or hardware, so biometric locks, firewalls, permissions, ACLs, those things are all going to be technical controls. Then we also have what are called administrative controls. These are policies and procedures. They're the rules. And then we have physical controls, which are doors, locks, man traps, lighting, physical guards, people who are on site monitoring a particular location. So if we think about, the physical personnel and the impediments to access that are done by, doors, that's a pretty big part of almost any organization. Now, obviously, we start talking about technology, then we start folding into the technical side. And then, of course, administrative should also be there as well. I don't know of any company that doesn't have a rule book that you could, beat someone unconscious with. The hacker mindset. So I juxtapose these slides because I want you to see that, hackers have a lot of different motivations, they have a lot of different strategies, they have a lot of different goals in mind. But one of the biggest things that you have to get into to counter hack or to be a systems analyst who tries to prevent these types of intrusions is to understand how they think. And then we also have to look at companies and how they look at these things. So if we look at how a hacker may implement a particular tactic versus how the rules of a particular organization or the different physical impediments that might be there, we see that it's an arms race between hackers and organizations. So the mindset helps us to understand that on occasion, something that may be obvious to you would not be obvious to a particular category of hacker, or vice versa. Something that's obvious to them may be absolutely obtuse to you. So one of the mindsets of hackers that is very difficult to divorce people from is the victimless crime, because we're not actually attacking people. It's not like you're going out with a baseball bat and just wanging people in the legs. It seems like there's nothing necessarily wrong with committing the crime. You're attacking a corporation, or you're attacking the government, and they just make up money and things like that. This leads into the Robin Hood ideal, which is where we have a group of haves and a group of have-nots. So stealing software and media from rich companies and delivering them to poor consumers via methods like BitTorrent is okay because companies have plenty of money, or they're insured, or they overcharge anyway, things like that. There's always that justification. So, software piracy and things like that, is part of the Robin Hood mentality. National pride. Patriotic hackers may seek to upset the balance of national power. They may want to disrupt the due process of an adversary, somebody who is being processed through criminal courts or something similar, or to bolster the opinion of their own country on the national stage, trying to find things that would improve their lot in life from a patriotic or national standpoint. Educational value. If you're doing it to learn, you're not really hurting anything. There was no malice intended. Still a crime. Just be aware. And then curiosity, which kind of ties into educational value. If you don't steal or change anything, breaking in just because you can is okay. And none of these are true, obviously. Crimes always do have a victim, even though they're not necessarily immediately apparent. Taking from the rich and giving to the poor is still theft. Bolstering national pride by means of illegal activity is still illegal. And even if you are learning and just curious, it's still considered a criminal violation, and these laws exist for a reason. Now, if these laws are unjust, we have to go through the channels and be able to revise those. I know that's an archaic ideal, but if we do not do that, if we give into our desire to see immediate change in these tactics, then we become no better than the individuals that we are criticizing in this way. So when we talk about motivation, we have to look at some subcategories here: means, motive, and opportunity. Does an attacker possess the ability to commit a crime? The crime in question, anyway. Motive: did they have the opportunity or reason? And then opportunity is just access and time. Do they have a reason to do it? Do they have the availability to do it? Do they have the ability to do it? And these three things come together to determine whether or not a particular individual would be considered a potential threat. When we get into risk management, that's something we talk about as well. The motives, goals, and objectives of information security attacks, commonly abbreviated as InfoSec. A motive is just a goal, so this ties into what we just read. And it originates from the idea that a target contains or processes something valuable. We're looking to, disrupt the continuity of a business that has unethical practices, or we're trying to expunge a record or damage the reputation of an individual who got away with a crime, or state actors, of course, they want to gain access to top secret materials, creating chaos and fear. That's more of the cyber terrorism aspect. Status, kind of like Reddit gold, internet famous kind of thing. Curiosity, ideology, ransom, financial gain, data manipulation. this is one that throws people off. You can even have beneficent motives. You can be doing something that would be morally laudable in order to drive an attack. And a lot of people will talk themselves into the idea that what they're doing is of benefit, and it is, it is the oppressed proletariat rising up in order to overturn an unfair judgment or some form of inequity of social justice. All of these motives are dependent on the attacker's state of mind. It's dependent on their education. It's dependent on whether or not they have, mental health issues in certain cases. People who are schizophrenic and have hallucinations in their minds based on the stream of stimulus that they're being fed on a daily, if not a moment-to-moment basis. Their perceptions of things are going to be different. Does that mean it's better, worse? That's a legal issue, and we'll get into that later on. But motives are deeply colored by the state of mind of an individual who is either contemplating or executing an attack. The attack itself is very much like the arrows we were looking at before: motive, method, and vulnerability. Do we have a reason? Do we have a technique? And do we have an available access point? Do we have an exploit we can take advantage of? Once a goal is determined, attackers can then employ various tools, techniques, and methods to exploit the system. Super condensed history of computer hacking essentially by decade, from the 1970s to the 2000s. Mainframe hacking starts in the 70s, where we have ARPANET and the very earliest birth cries of the net. Worms and viruses start to hit PCs. The Elk cloner virus, if you get a chance to take a look at that, high school kid basically made something that would be portable via floppy disk and would infect the system, and they just went from there. Website defacements in the 90s as access to the World Wide Web became more prevalent. And then in the 2000s, hacking for financial gain kind of exploded because broadband internet became much more common. Companies were doing a lot more business on the net. The burgeoning e-commerce world was getting started. eBay started in the 90s. I think Amazon started in the late 90s, early 2000s. So of course those platforms drove a lot of money into the internet, and thus, just like people trying to find a shortcut in any other aspect of their lives, trying to manipulate financial markets and things like that on the net, obviously increased in frequency. In the modern era, we have to worry about worms, automated tools that are trying to scrub through a network and manipulate things. Spam. 90% of all email that is sent is spam. So, spyware, adware, rootkits, tons of things that can compromise your machine. And another thing is that the ubiquity of the internet has led us from lone hackers who have very specific goals in mind to groups of hackers, especially groups of casual hackers. Crime rings, organized crime, hostile nations can all use the internet as an attack route, and this leads to cyber attacks being a very common form of crime. Hackers receive financing from criminal organizations, criminal activities, terrorists, foreign governments, self-financed. There's a number of different avenues that a hacker can take in order to gain whatever backing they need to be able to carry out their deeds, whatever those deeds may be. Information warfare, or InfoWar. These are 7 categories by which we can define warfare as it exists in the computer environment, the computer world. And there's a couple of things that exist in physical aspects as well, but for the most part, we're talking about warfare as it moves into the virtual space, cyberspace. First one is command and control, also called C2 or CNC. It refers to the impact that attackers can possess over compromised systems or networks, being able to gain and maintain control. Intelligence-based info war is sensor-based, observational, and directly corrupts technological systems. Electronic info war uses radio, electronic, and cryptographic techniques to break down communication, to try and use, cell phone jammers or even old school radio frequency jammers This is going to employ disruption of physical and logical means of transmission. Psychological information warfare is to demoralize, to produce terror. This is going to implement propaganda, media manipulation, shows of force. Difficult enough to talk about because it is still so fresh. We see this quite frequently when we talk about, riots that have occurred even in our own country, and we've seen lots of protests because of arguments over political powers, and the protests for the Keystone Pipeline and things like that. And we notice that there is a sense of demoralization that has to be made present in order to change people as individuals into an adversary, kind of a faceless group. So this one in particular is very damaging because we see what happens when people are able to hide behind online personas. And that leads us to cyber warfare. I'm going to do this kind of clockwise here. Cyber warfare in general is just the broadest set of info war. Systems versus personas. This is where we are taking a computer system and taking it against the online persona of an individual or group. Semantic attacks. So semantic versus syntax, for those of you who are possibly unaware or just need a refresher. Semantic deals with meaning, syntax deals with structure. So when let's say that you have an argument with your mom, and it's like, okay, well, I'm going over next door to go to my buddies, and I'm just going to go hang out over there for a while. And she's upset because you didn't do something you were supposed to do, and she's like, all right, that's fine. And you hear that tone. That's semantics, that's connotation, to where it's almost translating to I dare you, right? So semantic attacks to where, well, all I said was, and the text of what was said is not considered aggressive or not considered combative, but the content in context, what it means, what it implies, there's a number of different things that you can look at for this. That would be considered combative, but they can argue syntax versus semantics at that point. So cyber warfare is very, very tricky and very dangerous. Stealth takeover with the illusion of normalcy. You can have systems where essentially you're piggybacking in and you don't actually execute any form of control, but you have control of the system and you just kind of let it ride, and it allows you to observe what's going on inside of the system. Simula warfare. So as you can imagine, that comes from the terms warfare and simulation. And so, Mr. A, I hear you ask, what are we simulating? Well, simula warfare allows us to have the illusion of warfare between two groups in order to bolster public opinion, or we can switch it to simulating warfare in order to try and predict what will happen in the event of an incursion or similar. Economic info war. This is where we block information to disrupt economic infrastructure. This is something that is actually a very old concept. This is back from the earlier parts of the Industrial Revolution. Before the Panama Canal was dug, in order to get information from New York to California was a very difficult overland journey. If you were collecting and trading on the sea or ocean-based in a boat, you had to go around South America to go around. So, when we started developing methods by which we could get information to another aspect of the country very quickly, telegraph lines, things like that, it obviously started changing economics because people could get information based on proximity. If somebody in New York knew that a particular company was doing poorly or had some inside stock tips before legislation was passed against insider trading, they could contact business contemporaries in California or in another country by a telegraph cable and say, hey, go ahead and divest yourself of this particular company because they're going to go on the toilet. Whereas somebody who did not have that inside information would not be able to benefit from that. So eventually we go from looking at resources as physical objects to resources as being information. So economic information warfare is to my mind, penultimate representation of, information, knowledge being power, not necessarily bars of gold or physical reserves of resources. Though that is still obviously important. The hacker information warfare category is, again, very much what you would think it is: shutdowns, data errors, system or data theft, surveillance, false messages, defacements. Generally, these are going to employ the common tools of worms, viruses, sniffers, trojans, rootkits, logic bombs. These are going to be the conventional hacker toolkit that you're used to seeing. These 7 categories are as described by a man named Martin C. Libicki, mathematician, economics professor at the, I believe at the Party Institute. He works with the Rand Company, and he is also a track 2 diplomat for cybersecurity between the US and China. So he is a very busy man these days, but his theories on how we look at warfare in the modern climate have definitely shaped the debate in terms of the role of hackers and the role of defenders against those hackers. So I've given you a lot of stuff to kind of chew on regarding what hacking is and how it fits into the world stage at present. But it's important for us to also understand what ethics brings to the table. Ethical hacking means that we are behaving in a morally praiseworthy manner, meaning that we have permission, we have a focus on remediation. We're trying to find information that could be potentially exploited and provide that to the concerned party so that it can be improved. This is in contrast to what most people consider to be a standard hacker, that would be causing damage or enriching themselves. Penetration testing is a related field that is a structured and methodical means of examining, finding, attacking, and reporting the vulnerabilities of a target system. Pen tests are traditionally part of an IT audit, which is necessary to allow counterattack and prevention through anticipating malicious attacks and methodology. If any of you are hockey fans, I'm sure you'll be aware of the term puck chasing, largely popularized by guys like Gretzky back in the glory days of hockey, late 80s, early 90s. You don't go where the puck is. You go where the puck's gonna be. You try and figure out where's the open spot on the ice where somebody's gonna try and take a shot to get it across. Where is somebody gonna try and shoot to get it out in the open so that their teammate can take it to the goal line. Okay, so when we're looking at penetration testing, hindsight is 20/20, but it's still after the damage is done. When you get to the point where, oh wow, it would have been really nice to know that that particular outlet was wired poorly and was sparking and the house caught on fire, after we had a forensics investigator come in and say, oh, well, that's why your house burned down and all your stuff's gone. So it's definitely something that we want to understand as a preventative. We don't want to have to deal with remediation after the fact if we can avoid it. So let's look at some of the characteristics of ethical hacking. And again, this is just codifying what we've already read. We need to have the permission of the victim, the target, if you will. We're going to use a lot of the same strategies as a malicious hacker or black hat, but we are going to use care to avoid harming the system. So we need to establish what is called scope and the rules of engagement. And we need advanced knowledge of hacker techniques. So when we talk about scope as it relates to an ethical hack, it's important for us to understand the limitations of what the investigation is going to require, what the limits of the pen test or whatever it is. We are crucial to risk assessment as hackers, auditing, counter fraud, and then making sure that our best practices are kept in place. We can identify risks, we can highlight opportunities, reduce costs, and prevent loss potential from overwhelming an organization that is considered to be unprepared. And unless an organization knows its targets, we may not be able to provide a benefit to the organization. If we don't establish a set of rules because we don't know what the target is, we are going to run into potential problems. So we have to make sure that we educate our customers, our clients, that it's not magic. Like anything else technical, it's not a panacea. It's not be-all, end-all solutions in any scope. We can only test and provide analysis of a system. and we have to make sure that the safeguards are there. Now, if we need to come in and do a vulnerability assessment or things like that before a pen test, that is obviously a separate item. So it's important to understand that, ethical hackers have a lot of interesting things under their belts that allow them to explore the network of a particular organization, explore the cyberspace in which that particular organization exists. But it is not necessarily going to be that we walk in, flip 3 switches, and all of a sudden you're good to go for e-commerce or whatever you have. As a hacker, you have to possess both technical and non-technical skills. So on the technical side, we need to have a very deep awareness of major operating systems. So that would be, of course, Windows, Linux, and Mac. And then, of course, there's some more specialized ones that we will occasionally run into, like FreeBSD or CentOS. Network concepts and tech need to be something we're well aware of, as well as related applications. An aptitude with technical and security domains, as well as a high technical knowledge in constructing and deconstructing sophisticated attacks. It's not always going to be as simple as somebody's trying to carry out a DDoS attack with a bunch of people just pinging you. It might be that they're doing that in order to generate enough false positives to be able to carry out a different type of attack. And we'll talk about what some of those different types of stealthing attacks are later on. Other non-technical skills that are important is the ability to learn and adapt. I spent 17 years in retail before I started teaching, and one of the biggest things that I picked up from people that I worked with was people are either unteachable, meaning that they're unwilling, or they're unaware. They haven't been taught. So you can either be taught or not be taught, uneducated or unwilling. And you have to be willing to learn. No matter how much you know, there's always something that you don't know or something that you can clarify. So ability to learn, ability to adapt, absolutely crucial. A strong work ethic. It's not the easiest job to be in. The hours can be a little bit weird, depending on the company that you're working with. It can also be a whole lot of prep for about 10 minutes worth of activity in certain cases. Getting all your scripts together, getting all of your reconnaissance done, things like that. You also have to have really good communication skills. So not only do you have to be able to work hard, you have to be able to communicate the results of your work. So you have to be able to verbally describe what you're doing. You have to be able to describe it in the written word as well. And be able to put it in language that is accessible to people who do not have a technical background in a lot of cases. So if you have, a COO or a CEO of a company who is, very much, economics or business oriented, talking about the subtle nuances of, side channel hacking on a PLA or PLC circuit, that may be outside of their range of influence. That might be outside of something that they currently have the knowledge base for. So you have to be able to put it in terms that are a bit more digestible. So that means that being able to read the room, being able to be concise in your analogies, being able to find ways to communicate complicated concepts in simplified ways. You also have to make sure that you have a commitment to security and awareness of local, regional, and federal standards and legislation. You've got to remember, avalanche rolls downhill, but it always starts with that one little chip where that movement starts. So if we have strong understanding of local security standards and legislation, that's great. But if we violate federal law, we're still going to go to jail. And then on the other hand, if you focus on the big picture, but you miss something that's local, you could create a problem for your client at a particular branch or whatever else. So we got to understand that it goes all the way to the top and all the way back to the bottom. So when we do penetration testing or ethical hacking, we have to look at two different categories in which this may fall: white box and black box. Black box is where we have virtually no prior knowledge of the system before the attack begins. So this is used to simulate how the attacker would see the system from outside. They don't have any knowledge about the inner workings. White box testing is where advanced knowledge is provided. Usually it's like, hey, we've got this particular ASA or this type of firewall, and we want to make sure it works. So if there are specific vulnerabilities that you know this thing is susceptible to, that's what we want to focus on. That's something that happens quite often, is they decide to go ahead and implement a new appliance of some kind, and they want to make sure that that particular item in isolation does what it's supposed to do and then gets put into production. We get introduced into different network segments to make sure it works. There is, of course, also gray box testing, which, as you might imagine from our discussions of white box, or not white box, white hat and black hat, and then combining to be gray hat, is a merger between the two, to where you know some information about how the system works. Maybe, what you would get from basic reconnaissance, you've got maybe 6 to 12 hours to be able to start getting some recon together on a particular topic or a particular organization. The diagram here can be a little bit confusing because it's the same thing with different colors, but it's important to understand that there are triads that we have to deal with in information security, the biggest one being confidentiality, integrity, and availability, but we also have to look at usability. So how is it going to be focused from a user standpoint in terms of being able to actually access things? And this is because there is an inversely proportional relationship between security and convenience. As security increases, convenience goes down. Now, this does not necessarily mean that as convenience goes down, security goes up. You can have something that's really poorly designed, and it can be very insecure. Confidentiality means that only authorized subjects can access protected data. Integrity means that only authorized subjects can modify protected data, and the data being delivered to you is what it was advertised to be. And then availability is going to be that information and resources that manage information on a system are available on demand as advertised. So we must make sure that we are maintaining that and not letting the anti-triad occur, which would be disclosure instead of confidentiality, alteration, which is a lack of integrity, and disruption, which is a lack of availability. We have to look at the usability triad in order to see security, functionality, and ease of use. So it has to work. We have to be able to access it without requiring advanced degrees just to turn the darn thing on. And then, of course, security to make sure that we're not concerned about our information being bled out as we're using it. So it's interesting because you're going to see a lot of echoes of this as we proceed through the semester. Let's look at some elements of information security beyond just the triad. So information security is a term I've used several times throughout this presentation, and it means safeguarding systems that use, store, and transmit information. It also means that we're protecting the data itself from unauthorized access, disclosure, alteration, and destruction. Another definition that I found, which was interesting, it was in one of my textbooks when I was undertaking my master's program. State of well-being of information and infrastructure in which possibilities of theft, tampering, or disruption of information and services is kept low or tolerable. That ties into something that I learned from one of my first professors when I got into security, which was, it's never a question of if, it's a question of when. When something will happen to your system. So at that point, you have to accept that if it's going to happen, then I need to make sure that I am as well defended as possible. But no defense is absolute. So how do I not only try and prevent what attacks can be prevented, how do I mediate or reduce the attacks that I cannot stop? And that comes into the expanded triad here. We get to the pentad, I guess you would say, if we're talking about 5. So confidentiality, integrity, and availability we're aware of. And confidentiality means only the people who should see it do. Integrity means that the data that you're asking for is the data that you get. And availability means that it's available when required. So the other two are authenticity and non-repudiation. Authenticity is the quality of being genuine. Is something what it purports itself to be? This may seem like it is the same as integrity. And while it is related, it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. Integrity is because data can change. Data can be updated, data can be moved. Authenticity means that we have a static entity that we need to verify. Okay? So this means that we have trustworthiness of an integrity-based system, and we also have genuine nature to something that is an authenticity-based system. Authentication and integrity are close, but not the same. And then non-repudiation, which is kind of a similar idea again, but this is specifically saying that we are going to identify that the sender is genuine, because we have to make sure that if they send a particular message or if they perform a particular action, that we know who it was. So this is a big part of why I tell students in face-to-face classes that you do not want to ever walk away from your workstation with your credentials logged in, because according to the laws of the school, in terms of the acceptable use policy, if anything happens while that is logged in, that is your responsibility because you provided your credentials for that particular point of access. It helps to prevent people who would, I'll just log in and walk away, and you do whatever it is you're going to do, and I don't know anything, so plausible deniability, da 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 da. That doesn't necessarily work in terms of legal defense, but there were people who would try it, so non-repudiation is a major branch of information security that we attempt to circumvent that at its source. Now, once we've established that a penetration test is going to occur, the ethical hacker or hackers are given the parameters. We have discussed which tests are going to be done. We have determined what types of attacks are going to be used based on the TAP model, most likely. We have determined the suitability of these attacks, and we have evaluated potential advantages and side effects. We are trying to minimize potential damage that could be committed to an organization that would disrupt their normal business continuity, because usually penetration tests have to be done on live equipment. So if it's something that's going to occur during normal business hours, we have to make sure that we're not actively disrupting business while we are trying to demonstrate these potential vulnerabilities. Once all this is done, we can finalize our planning, we can get legal to write up our contracts, and then perform the test. And it is very important that you have a decent legal team when you're working in ethical hacking, because you want to make sure if there is any misstep, if there is any item of the test that goes awry, you do not want to be held responsible. I'll give you an example. Let's say that you are doing a penetration test for a nonprofit. It could be disaster relief, it could be, an animal shelter, it can be all this sort of thing. And there are some issues with record keeping, and you want to make sure that they're compliant because they're receiving funding from a particular government source or things like that. So they have to be compliant. So you go in and you start doing scans on systems and things like that, and one of your tools throws up that there are some hidden files or data carving or things like that needs to be performed, and you find child pornography on a workstation that is owned by that particular organization. Depending on the laws of your region, state, city, whatever your local ordinance is, and then federal law, you have to report it regardless, but the order of operations is going to be slightly different. But you have to have a provision in that contract to say, if we find anything that requires reporting to law enforcement, we are going to immediately terminate the test, contact law enforcement, and wait for further information before we continue. Now, number one, this is to protect you as the tester, so that way information is not being disseminated that should not be. It is protecting the organization, because there needs to be an examination from somebody who is not receiving funding from the company in law enforcement. So there needs to be an unbiased party. There needs to be a clear level of investigation that would not be manipulated by the type of materials that would be carried out through a pen test. So these pieces have to be deliberated through the contract, because if the contract is terminated for any particular reason, do you still get paid? What happens if X, Y, or Z occurs and somebody gets arrested, or finances are seized or frozen or things like that? What can you be responsible for? Do you have to appear in court? What testimony do you have to give, etc.? So that needs to be part of the contract when you're discussing an ethical hack. You also have to look at the methodology of where is the start point, where is the stop point. And you can look at kind of the flow chart here that we've got: planning, discovery, attack. Now, as we get to the attack phase, you'll notice that there are 2 arrows instead of one of which goes into additional discovery, which is not necessarily what I was just describing. That is a very particular legal peccadillo that you'll want to try and stay away from if at all possible. Obviously, nobody wants to discover that sort of thing. But if you have additional vulnerabilities that you are made aware of that need to be incorporated as part of the discovery process for reconnaissance, that will obviously loop back. Once the attack is completed successfully and we have logged all of our information, then we go into reporting. We are to be documenting throughout the entirety of this performative test, because you want to make sure that you are documenting items leading up to a potential incident, because you can't really foresee them, as well as the post-mortem, if you will. So we want to see predictive material that is before and after. So let's look at some common methodologies, or some common steps to the methodology. These are the main 5 phases we talk about with ethical hacking. We have reconnaissance, scanning, infiltrate, escalate, and exfiltrate, maintain access, sometimes referred to as gain and maintain, and then we have obfuscation, recovering tracks. Reconnaissance is where an attacker will passively acquire information about the intended victim and or the intended victim's systems. In scanning, an attacker will take the information obtained during phase 1 and use it to acquire more detailed information. Reconnaissance can be a little bit more hands-off, to where we're not directly interacting with the individual or the organization. Scanning traditionally is going to be more direct access. Once we've gotten our scan together, we're going to take that information and use it to try and exploit any vulnerabilities that we have identified. So that would be infiltrate and escalate. Escalate meaning we're trying to amplify whatever privileges we possess from the initial breach so that we can gain administrative access or something similar. Exfiltration is where we are trying to access and procure protected data, protected resources, protected information. In the maintain access section, this is where we're going to install additional exploits or other items to try and maintain a foothold to present at a later date. Now, during the assault phase, which is part of the whole infiltrate, exfiltrate, maintain access, kind of in between, almost like step 3.5. It's not presented in all types of attacks, but this is where the destructive phase exists. Now, this can occur either after infiltration, before gaining additional access, or after the maintain access. Just depends. Then we get to obfuscation. And this is where we have an attacker using their escalated privileges to cover their tracks, erase presences of their system accesses, clearing logs or things like that. Not all attackers are going to exercise this option, but it is fairly common for attackers that know what they're doing. Again, you could be supremely confident that they're never going to find you or whatever else, but we're eliminating the possibility that they will have evidence with which to do so. So let's talk about these phases in a little bit more depth. Reconnaissance first. Recon is a preparatory phase. This is where we're trying to get information prior to an attack getting started. So maybe we're looking for a way in, an ingress point, once we know some more information. Recon falls into 2 primary categories, passive and active. Passive is without any kind of direct contact, so public records, news releases, things like that. Active reconnaissance is where we have direct involvement by any means. So that can be telephone calls, fishing, dumpster diving. People often undervalue how much stuff you can find in the business's trash. Now we get into the scan. This is where we start actually involving ourselves with the network of the target. Pre-attack is where we'll look at the network for specific information based on recon. We'll do a port scan, and then we'll start pulling info. Port scan can be done with standard auto dialers, port scans through things like Nmap, Nessus, there's a couple of different ones, ping tools, and vulnerability scanners. Once we start pulling info, we're going to get data from a machine, what ports are open, what their status is, operating systems, device types, software versions, as well as uptime. Gain and maintain. This is where we're going to go ahead and crack defenses, get in. This can be done at levels of the network device, so we can crack in at the router level or switch level, application level, or at the operating system. Password cracking, password guessing, buffer overflow, denial of service, hijacks. In any event, we get in, and if we're as a standard user, then we go ahead and start trying to push towards administrative level. So this allows us to compromise intermediate systems and then obtain complete control of a system. So if we can break into a web server, can we migrate upwards to be able to gain control of a file server, or be able to gain control of a router, or other aspects of the data closet? Maintaining access is where attackers will attempt to retain ownership of the system once they're in, just trying to wedge their foot in the door, as it were. This can be done with backdoors, rootkits, trojans, in whatever situation they're trying to do. They will go ahead and upload whatever their control unit is and be able to manipulate system configurations to be able to hold on to that access, providing a backdoor for later on. This cracked system, once it is established, can then be used to attack other systems, and that's where we have our lateral expansion of our foothold inside of that particular autonomous system. Now we're at the last part of the primary hacking phase, which is obfuscation, covering your tracks. By hiding your tracks, you're hiding your identity. As I talked about just a couple slides ago, you don't really want to leave evidence behind by which an individual could try and figure out who you are. Attackers may wish to prolong their access, leaving an entry point open, things like that. They could also try and remove evidence that could lead to prosecution. Usually the big stuff is going to be logs. So let's discuss the laws and ethical standards that are pertinent to ethical hacking. In ethics, we discuss trust. Trust is somebody gives us a certain set of permissions based on the assumption that we're not going to use those permissions to cause damage. So the trust is placed on us by the client to use discretion when performing certain tests to make sure that we are not violating the terms of the agreement. If we break that trust, it can degrade trust in other aspects. So if they say, well, if they're willing to lie about methodology, maybe they're willing to lie about the results. Something similar. Legally, if we break those scope limitations, if we break the rules of engagement, it may be cause for clients to take legal action. If you violate a contract, there are consequences. If you violate the test scope and it results in damages, the client may also take legal action in order to remediate those losses. So there's a lot of trust that gets placed and a lot of potential legal responsibility. So we're going to look at some examples of different laws and ethical standards that affect what we have to deal with as ethical hackers, making sure that we're staying within not only the rules of engagement in terms of the contract as it was drafted with the client, but in terms of regional, state level, and federal level legislation. So we've got PCI DSS. PCI DSS is a payment card standard. So that is dealing with credit cards, debit cards, etc. ISO 27001, HIPAA, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, U.S. Electronic Communications Privacy Act, Sarbanes-Oxley, Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and Federal Information Security Modernization Act, also known as the FISMA Act. PCI DSS, or the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, is a proprietary standard in information security for organizations that process cardholder information for major credit, debit, prepaid, ATM, and point-of-sale cards. Now, this standard is pretty broad in that it affects all entities involved in the processing, so merchants, processors, acquirers, issuers, and service providers. Anybody that handles credit card information or similar, they're going to be subject to this, as well as anyone else who stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data. So somebody like Amazon, they have to store virtual wallet payment methods, things like that. They have to be PCI DSS compliant. So the high-level overview is the following 7 items. Build and maintain a secure network. That network needs to be regularly monitored and tested. We need to implement strong access control measures, maintain a vulnerability management program, protect cardholder data, maintain an information security policy, just a written documentation of what the rules are, so that way as the business expands, contracts, or changes in general, we have the ability to refer back to a consistent document of what is to be expected. Failure to meet these requirements may lead to fines or termination of processing privileges. So you gotta follow the rules or they're gonna spank you. ISO IEC 2701, 2013 revision is what our text talks about. This is going to specify requirements for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving an information security management system within the organization. So this is largely talking about how we write our documentation, what standards we fall into there. And something you'll learn as a hacker is if you get into the administration aspect of it, if you get into the clerical, it is an endless rabbit hole of all of these different standards and restrictions and regulations for how things are written. And this is a good thing. It is important to be able to have a stabilized set of rules so that way there's predictability across multiple different platforms. If you're a hacker and you work for several different organizations over the course of your career, you want it to be clear that the basics, the core of what you do should be the same. There may be some little vagaries that change, like obviously California has different data protection laws than North Carolina, but we still have the same general idea of how things are handled. So some suitable uses. We want to formulate security recs and objectives, identify and clarify existing processes, make sure that our risk management is cost effective, make sure that we're not overreaching, determine the status of information security management activities, make sure we're in legal and regulatory compliance, implement business enabling InfoSec, define new processes as needed, and provide relevant data to customers, data disclosure, like your, how they handle your information, things like that. HIPAA. I've known quite a few people who worked in networking and IT that ended up working in the healthcare industry with, data of this sort. So HIPAA stands for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which I believe was signed into law under Clinton. So it's been around for a little bit. We've got some statutes here that we're going to look at. Electronic Transaction and Code Set, basically meaning that the way that they draft all this information, the way that they write up these electronic reports, have to use all the same basic tools. So my analogy often is it's kind of like combining like dollar store Lego with real Lego. It just doesn't quite look right if you don't use all the same stuff. Like the dollar store Lego is fine, but if you start mixing the two, it starts getting kind of janky looking. So it's important to understand there is a separation here, to where if you're going to do business electronically and you want to be HIPAA compliant, you have to follow the HIPAA structure. Okay. Privacy rule gives you federal protection for health information of covered entities. Covered entities, of course, can cover a broad spectrum. And it also gives an array of patient rights regarding that information. So it's not only protecting the data management entities, the people who would record, use, and store that information, but the patient in general. Because health insurance it not only affects people who work in the health insurance industry, but it also affects providers such as doctors, nurses, hospitals, things like that, even pharmacies. The security rule, this is going to specify administrative, physical, and technical safeguards so that we can ensure that the triad, the information security triad, is going to handle the protected information that's required in the appropriate fashion. So you can see here again, technical, administrative, and physical. We've got that TAP series of administrative controls coming back into place. National identifier requirements. This kind of tags into the code set standards we talked about in point number 1. This makes sure that we have nationally unique identifier numbers attached to standard transactions. So if somebody gets bitten by a rabid animal or somebody, whatever the actual event was in the healthcare process, we want to make sure that that has its own unique identifier to be coded so that that way it doesn't get identified as, somebody had a brick fall on them or something similar. And then the enforcement rule, kind of a self-regulating standard to make sure that all the rules that we've listed already get enforced. So it's the rules of this is what you should do, and at the end it's this is what will happen if you don't. Sarbanes-Oxley, I'm not going to read through all of this, but there's a couple of key points we want to pay attention to because this is probably one of the largest pieces of legislation that was introduced to deal with corporate disclosure. And a lot of times as a hacker, you'll be dealing with things that overlap financial records. So if you are involved with financial records, depending on your company's involvement, depending on your training, you may be considered to be a person with responsibility to report. So you have to make sure that if there are violations of this that you are aware of, that you can't be maintaining complicity in that. You can't make yourself an accomplice. So Sarbanes-Oxley is all about oversight to make sure that people can be examined by someone who doesn't have a conflict of interest. If we look in Title II specifically, it is auditor independence, making sure that people who are reviewing the audits of a particular agency that does securities, usually securities was the big one, making sure that people weren't essentially rubber stamping one another. A company that did corporate securities, not financial securities, not security like physical lock and key, that they weren't buddying up with an auditing company to where they would just kind of sign off on one another. Corporate responsibility, somebody has to have their name on it at the end of the day, making sure that people are accountable in some way, working on ways to eliminate conflicts of interest, making sure that the studies that are done internally as well as externally are accurate and are properly reported. Specific crimes that previously had kind of a wrist slap, those were overridden and made to be much more, what I would say, poignant. They would make sense relative to the level of the offense. And corporate fraud accountability in particular allowed the SEC to be able to freeze larger unusual payments in order to try and prevent money laundering or malfeasance as it comes to trying to hide corporate losses. And let's go ahead and talk about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and FISMA, which is the Federal Information Security Management Act. DMCA is relatively common piece of legislation that we talk about, got a lot of attention in the late 90s because of Napster. Anytime there's any kind of DRM issues, DMCA gets trotted out. This is a copyright law that implements 2 treaties from the World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO, from 1996. I believe this was under Clinton. Defines legal prohibitions against circumvention of technological protection measures, DRM, and against removal or alteration of copyright management information. So, interestingly enough, with Taiwan being in the news again, a big part of why we have the DMCA is because international copyright law is so tenuous, and it's difficult to make sure that people in other countries aren't making knockoffs because you can't really enforce the prohibitions. So, transatlantic partnership gets brought up, things like that. But in general, in the U.S., the DMCA is why people get in trouble for file sharing or things like that. Federal Information Security Management Act, or FISMA, is going to be a comprehensive framework for effective InfoSec controls for federal operations. So obviously the F in FISMA is federal, so this is going to be something that's like government dictates for how we're going to handle categorizing assets, minimum security requirements, selecting appropriate controls to protect those assets, assessing controls and their effectiveness, and security authorization. So very much like we might otherwise use ISO 27001 or NIST. There's a couple of different frameworks you can look into. FISMA in particular says if it's information-based intelligence in the security field, we have to look at FISMA for the regulation. So everybody's got their own corner to stay in. So that was it. That was chapter 1. We talked about classes and motives of hackers, history of hacking, ethical hacking, pen testing, and we got a little bit into some of the laws and ethical standards that pen testers and ethical hackers have to be aware of in order to be able to do their jobs. Hopefully it was informative. We spent over an hour talking about this. But if you have any questions or concerns, of course, you can always contact me through email, through direct message, through Blackboard. Come by my office hours. I'm always glad to hear from students and to answer questions. And who knows, if your concern is sufficiently poignant, we may actually have to revise and re-record and bring up an addendum for you. Well, thanks again for listening. Hope you had a reasonably entertaining time. Try not to make it too terribly boring. And then I will see you in the next class.